welcome to my channel. Today's story is a journey of secrets, transformation, and a side of myself. There is a particular kind of loneliness that has nothing to do with being alone. It is the loneliness that comes from standing in a room full of people who think they know you, while you know, quietly and with a weight that never quite leaves your chest, that they are only seeing a version of you, a carefully maintained, carefully constructed version that you built not to deceive them, but to protect yourself from the look on their faces if they ever saw what was underneath. That loneliness is a slow kind. It does not announce itself. It does not arrive in a single terrible moment. It accumulates over years, layer upon layer, like sediment at the bottom of a river, invisible but always there, shaping the ground you walk on. I know that loneliness. I have lived inside it for most of my life. And if you are watching this right now, there is a good chance you know it too, even if the reason for yours is entirely different from mine. Because that particular species of quiet loneliness, the loneliness of the unlived self, is far more common than any of us are ever taught to admit. My name is Daniel. That is what I'll go by here, though the people closest to me over the years have called me many things. I am in my mid-40s now. I live in a mid-sized city in the American Midwest, in a house that smells like coffee in the mornings and whatever my wife, Renata, decides to cook on Sunday afternoons. We have a dog named Clifford who is aggressively uninterested in anything that isn't food or sleep, and we have a life together that I would describe, without any sentimentality or exaggeration, as genuinely good. Not perfect. Not without its complications and its scars. But good. Real. Chosen. Getting to this life, though, getting to the point where I could sit here and tell you this story without my voice catching in my throat from shame, took a very long time. It took 4 decades of confusion, secrecy, grief, miscommunication, self-betrayal, fear, and eventually, slowly, something that I can only call grace. The kind of grace that doesn't come from the sky but from another person looking at you, all of you, and saying quietly, I see you. I know what this is. And I'm not going anywhere. What I want to share with you today is the full arc of that journey. Not because my story is dramatic or exceptional, in many ways it is not. But because the specific kind of silence I carried for so long, and the specific kind of identity I had to learn to hold without apology, is something that a lot of people still carry alone. And I think silence, when it serves no one, is worth breaking. So let me start at the beginning. The real beginning, which, like most real beginnings, doesn't feel like a beginning at all when you are living through it. I grew up in a small town in Ohio in the early 1980s. My father worked at a manufacturing plant. My mother was a dental hygienist who also did alterations out of our house on weekends. She was an excellent seamstress, quick and precise, with a sewing room at the back of the house that smelled like fabric and cedar and the particular metallic warmth of an iron left sitting on its rest. I had an older brother, Marcus, who was everything you might imagine an older brother in that time and place to be: athletic, effortlessly social, comfortable in his skin with a naturalness that I admired and quietly envied. And then there was me. I was a quiet child. Teachers wrote things like thoughtful and introspective on my report cards, which I understood even then was a polite way of saying I was odd and they weren't quite sure what to do with me. I was not unhappy, exactly. I had friends. I liked school well enough. I read a great deal, adventure stories, mostly, but also anything I could find about other cultures, other ways of living, other versions of what a human life could look like. I was, I think, deeply curious about the full range of human experience in a way that the town I grew up in didn't quite have the vocabulary for. The first moment I remember, the very first moment where something shifted in me that I couldn't explain or name, I was 7 years old. My mother had been working late on a formal dress for a neighbor's daughter, a pale lavender thing with a hand-stitched lace collar, and she had left it hanging on the dress form in her sewing room while she went to answer the phone. I wandered in, the way children wander into rooms that are momentarily unwatched, and I looked at that dress for a long time. I reached out and touched the fabric. It was softer than anything I usually touched, softer than my own clothes, softer than my sheets, softer almost than I had words for. And I felt something that I could not then and cannot now fully describe. It wasn't longing, exactly. It wasn't envy. It was something more like recognition. Like seeing a color you don't have a name for but immediately know is your favorite. I put my hand back at my side and walked back out of the room. I didn't think about it again for a while. The mind of a 7-year-old has a remarkable capacity for setting things aside that it isn't yet equipped to process. But the thing about these moments, these small, quiet, seemingly inconsequential moments of recognition, is that they don't go away. They simply wait. They wait with infinite patience while you grow up around them, while you build a life around them, while you construct an identity and a set of habits and a social role that is entirely organized around their absence. They wait, and eventually, when you are tired enough or honest enough or both, they make themselves known again. For me, the next moment came when I was 9. I was home alone on a Saturday afternoon, a rarity, since our house was usually full of noise, and in a spirit of pure, unpremeditated curiosity, I walked into my mother's bedroom and opened her closet. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I was just looking, the way children look at things that belong to adults, trying to understand what adulthood contains. But when I stood there looking at her things, her blouses and skirts and the few nice dresses she wore to church, I felt that same wordless recognition from 2 years before, only sharper now. Older. I reached in and touched the sleeve of a dark green blouse. I looked behind me at the empty hallway. I took the blouse off the hanger and held it up, and then, in a moment that felt both terrifying and profoundly natural, I put it on. I stood in front of my mother's full-length mirror for perhaps 45 seconds. I looked at myself. I did not feel strange or wrong or sick. I felt, in a way that I would not have the language to articulate for another 30 years, like I was looking at a more complete version of myself. Not a different person. Not the wrong person. A more complete one. Then I heard a car door close outside, and I pulled the blouse off so fast I nearly tore a button. I hung it back up, smoothed the fabric, and walked out of the room with my heart beating so hard I could hear it in my ears. I went and sat in front of the television and watched cartoons and did not move until my mother came in with grocery bags and said, "Hey, baby, you want to help me unpack?" "Sure," I said. And I helped. And I never said a word. That was the beginning of the secret. Not the beginning of what I was. I think now that what I am has always been what I am, but the beginning of the silence around it. The careful, practiced, daily silence that would become, over the next 30-something years, as natural to me as breathing. Through my childhood and into adolescence, I developed what I can only describe as a double life, though that phrase makes it sound far more dramatic than it was. Most of it happened inside my own head. I was not regularly sneaking into my mother's closet or doing anything that most people would consider out of the ordinary. I was a normal-seeming boy who did normal-seeming things, played baseball badly, did reasonably well in school, had a small group of friends, developed opinions about music and movies and sports teams with the same earnest passion that all kids do. But underneath that normal surface, running parallel to it at all times, was a current of private awareness that I was carrying something I couldn't show anyone. Something that, if seen, would change everything. I want to be precise about what that something was, because I think precision matters here. It was not, as I understood it even then, a desire to be a girl or to be a woman. I was not experiencing what I would later come to understand as gender dysphoria in the clinical sense. It was something more nuanced and, in some ways, harder to explain because it doesn't fit neatly into any of the categories that our culture gives us. What I felt was a deep, persistent draw toward the aesthetic and emotional world that my culture labeled as feminine, towards softness, towards certain textures and silhouettes, toward a kind of emotional openness and decorative self-expression that I was never once encouraged to explore as a boy. I felt, in a way I could not articulate, that some part of who I was existed in that territory, and that territory was locked behind a door marked, "Not for you." In adolescence, this became complicated by the obvious fact that adolescence complicates everything. I watched my male peers navigate their identities with a kind of bravado that felt deeply alien to me, the performances of toughness, the careful emotional constriction, the elaborate social rituals of masculinity that required you to never, ever, under any circumstances, appear soft or uncertain or curious about the wrong things. I performed alongside them, because I was young and frightened and had no alternative model to look toward, but the performance cost me something. It cost me the ability to be genuinely present with other people. When you are always monitoring yourself, always editing your own instincts in real time, you cannot quite show up fully. There is always a delay, always a filter, always a fraction of your attention devoted to the management of your own image rather than to the actual human in front of you. By the time I was 16, I had found what I thought of as a safer and more sustainable version of my private life. I had access, occasionally and carefully, to a small collection of things I kept hidden in a box at the back of my closet, a soft scarf from a thrift store, a single blouse I had found at a garage sale, a simple pair of flats that were one size too large and that I had bought with lawn mowing money from a bin at a discount store. I was not hurting anyone. I was not, in the moral sense of the word, doing anything wrong. But I was saturated with shame nonetheless, because the culture I lived in had taught me, thoroughly and repeatedly, that what I was doing was evidence of something broken in me. Something to be fixed or hidden or destroyed before anyone could see it. Shame is a fascinating and terrible emotion. It is different from guilt in a way that matters enormously. Guilt says, I did something wrong. Shame says, I am something wrong. Guilt is about behavior. Shame is about being. And the specific shame I carried through adolescence and into early adulthood was not the shame of having made a bad choice or hurt someone, it was the shame of simply existing as I was, of having a nature that didn't fit the container I had been handed and told to fill. It is the kind of shame that doesn't respond to logic or reassurance, because it isn't really about anything rational. It is about the internalized verdict of a culture that drew a map of what a person was supposed to be and left certain territories blank, marked only with the old cartographer's warning, here be monsters. I went to college in Columbus. I studied communications, which suited both my genuine interests and my practiced ability to understand how people present themselves to one another. I made friends. I had relationships with women. I liked women, I was, and am, genuinely attracted to women, which added its own layer of confusion to the mix, because the narratives I had been given about people like me, to the extent that any narratives existed at all in the early 1990s in the Midwest, all seemed to assume that the kind of person I was could not also be the kind of person I was in every other respect. The categories didn't overlap in the map I had been given. My first serious relationship, in my early 20s, ended in part because of my secret, though not in the way you might expect. My girlfriend at the time, a warm, funny, intensely perceptive woman named Lauren, didn't discover anything. There was no dramatic reveal. What happened was slower and sadder than that. Over the 2 years we were together, she became increasingly aware that I was not fully present, that there was a part of me she couldn't reach, a room she was never allowed into. She described it once, sitting across from me at a diner table on a cold February afternoon, as the feeling that you're always slightly somewhere else. She was right. I was. And I didn't have the words or the courage to explain why. We broke up civilly, as people who like each other but are not quite the right fit for each other tend to do. I told myself I would find a way to be more present in the next relationship. I told myself I would figure out how to manage this better. I did not tell myself the truth, which was that no amount of management was going to solve a problem that was not fundamentally a management problem. My 20s were a period of deep ambivalence. I built a functional adult life, I worked in marketing at a mid-size company, I had my own apartment, I had friendships that I valued, I traveled a bit. On the surface, everything was fine. Below the surface, I was carrying the same secret I had always carried, and it was getting heavier. Not because the secret itself had changed, but because I had spent so many years pressing it down that I was running out of the energy required to keep pressing. There is a metaphor I use sometimes when I try to explain this to people. Imagine holding a basketball underwater. You can do it. It takes effort, but you can do it. You can even get used to it. Up to a point. But you cannot let go of the basketball without it shooting back to the surface, and after years and years of holding it down, your arms are exhausted, and you know, in the part of you that is capable of knowing things you don't want to know, that eventually you are going to have to let go. I did not let go in my 20s. But the basketball was pushing back harder. The turning point, or the beginning of the turning point, came when I was 31. I had been seeing a therapist for about 4 months, not because of the secret, ostensibly, but because I had been experiencing a persistent low-grade anxiety that was affecting my sleep and my ability to concentrate at work. My therapist, a man named Dr. Khalid who had an office full of plants and a way of listening that made you feel like you were the only thing in the room worth attending to, was methodical and patient and not at all prone to dramatic interpretations. In our 4th month of sessions, after we had spent considerable time on family history and work stress and relationship patterns, he asked me, very quietly, if there was anything I hadn't told him that I thought might be relevant. I sat with that question for a very long time. He let me sit with it. The room was quiet except for the faint sound of traffic outside and the hum of the HVAC system. And then, for the first time in my entire life, I told someone the truth. It took me a long time, and it came out haltingly and in no particular order, and I watched his face the entire time for the verdict. He gave me no verdict. He listened. When I was done, when I had said everything I had been carrying for 24 years, he asked me a single question: how long have you been carrying this alone? Since I was 7, I said. He nodded slowly. That's a long time, he said. Not with pity. With something that felt like genuine acknowledgement of the weight of it. That session, that single hour, did not solve anything. But it cracked something open. Because for the first time, I had said the truth out loud to another human being, and the world had not ended. Dr. Khalid had not recoiled from me or referred me elsewhere or told me I needed to be fixed. He had simply listened, and in his listening, he had given me something I had not known I needed, the experience of being known and remaining valued in the same moment. Over the following year, my understanding of myself began to shift. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, the way light changes in a room over the course of an afternoon, you don't notice it happening, and then suddenly you realize the quality of everything around you is different. With Dr. Khalid's guidance, I began to do something I had never allowed myself to do. I began to approach my own nature with curiosity rather than shame. I began to read, to research, to seek out the writing and testimony of other people who had lived with similar experiences. And in doing so, I discovered something that was, in a strange way, both obvious and revolutionary: I was not unique. I was not aberrant in the clinical sense. I was not, in any meaningful definition of the word, broken. I was one of many, many people who moved through the world with a relationship to gender and self-presentation that existed outside the narrow binary they had been handed, and who had paid enormous costs to keep that relationship private. This did not, to be clear, immediately or easily dissolve the shame. Shame that has been growing for 24 years does not dissolve in a year of therapy. But it began to loosen its grip. And in the space that opened up as the shame loosened, something else moved in, not pride, exactly, not yet, but a kind of tentative, fragile self-compassion. The beginning of the ability to look at myself without flinching. I met Renata when I was 34. She was 32. We met at a fundraiser for an arts organization. She worked in graphic design and I had come with a colleague who was on the board. She was wearing a blue dress and arguing animatedly with a woman about the spatial logic of a particular installation in the gallery, and she was the most fully, completely herself person I had ever seen in a party setting. And I walked over and introduced myself not because I had a strategy but because I was drawn to her the way you are drawn to something honest when you have spent a very long time surrounded by performance. We talked for 3 hours that night. We went to a diner afterward and talked for 2 more. We exchanged numbers and began a conversation that, in one form or another, has never really stopped. I want to describe our early relationship accurately because I think the details matter. Renata is a person of exceptional emotional intelligence, not the passive, receptive kind, but the active, curious kind. She asks questions the way a good journalist does, not to gather information but because she genuinely wants to understand. She reads people with a precision that is, if you are used to being the reader in the room, slightly disorienting. Within the first few months of our relationship, she told me, with characteristic directness, that she could feel a room in me that she wasn't allowed into, and that she wasn't going to push, but she wanted me to know that she was curious about it and that whatever was in it wouldn't change what she thought of me. She said this sitting in her apartment, cross-legged on the couch, with the unself-conscious confidence of someone who has learned that naming the thing in the room is almost always better than walking carefully around it. I looked at her for a long moment after she said it. My instinct was to deflect, to say something like, "I'm just a private person," or, "It's nothing, really," the deflections I had been polishing for 30 years. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the 3 years of work I had done with Dr. Khalid. Maybe it was the way she said it, not as an accusation but as an invitation. Maybe it was simply that I was tired of the weight of what I was carrying and here, suddenly, was someone offering, without conditions or judgment, to help carry it. I didn't tell her everything that night. But I told her more than I had ever told anyone who wasn't a therapist. I told her that there was something about my relationship to gender and self-expression that was not quite what she might expect. I told her that I had been carrying it alone for a very long time and that it made intimacy difficult because it meant I was never fully visible. I watched her face the same way I had watched Dr. Khalid's, and she did what he had done, she listened. She asked a few gentle questions. She did not make a face. She did not pull back. And when I was done with the small portion I had shared, she said something that I want to write down somewhere and carry with me always. She said, "I appreciate you trusting me with that. It sounds like you've been working really hard to keep it contained, and I just want you to know that you don't have to contain it around me." I fell in love with her in that moment, I think, though I know I had already been falling for months. Over the next year, we were officially together by then, spending most of our time between her apartment and mine. I told her the rest. Gradually, incrementally, testing each new disclosure against her reaction and finding, each time, the same patient acceptance. She asked thoughtful questions. She did her own reading. She sat with the complexity of it without trying to resolve it into something simpler than it was. And as I became more fully known to her, I became, paradoxically, more fully present, more genuinely there in our relationship than I had ever been in any relationship before, because I was no longer dedicating a portion of my attention to the constant maintenance of my own concealment. This is one of the things I most want to convey to anyone watching this who is carrying something similar. The energy that secrecy requires is enormous, and you often don't realize how enormous it is until you set it down. When you stop hiding, you get yourself back. Not just the part you were hiding, but all of yourself, the attention and presence and capacity for connection that had been rerouted into the project of not being seen. Renata and I talked about what this meant practically, what it looked like, what it required, what boundaries we each needed. These were not always easy conversations. There were moments of uncertainty and discomfort on both sides. She had questions that took time to process. I had fears about what acceptance would require of her, fears that came from a lifetime of assuming that being truly known would mean being truly rejected. We navigated it together, which is the only honest way I can describe it, with the kind of deliberate, patient teamwork that I have come to believe is the foundation of any durable partnership. We were married when I was 37. The wedding was small, 40 people in a restaurant event space, Renata's own design work incorporated into everything from the invitations to the centerpieces. I wore a suit that I loved, and in my jacket pocket I kept a small folded piece of paper on which she had written something to me that morning, which I won't share here because it is ours, but which I can say spoke directly to all of me, not just the version that fit the expected frame. By the time we married, Renata had a full and clear understanding of my relationship to what I'll call, for the purposes of this story, the feminine part of my self-expression. She knew that this was not a secret or a source of shame in our home anymore. She knew that I kept some things, certain clothing, certain accessories, certain ways of inhabiting my own comfort that I could only fully access in private, and she had, over the years of our relationship, moved from a position of accepting this about me to actively, warmly including it in her understanding of who her husband was. She had a way of referencing it in our private life that was affectionate and matter-of-fact and utterly without judgment, the same tone she might use to reference any other intimate thing that belonged to the interior of our marriage. What she had never done, and what I had never asked or expected or imagined her doing, was introduce this part of me to the world outside our home. That world, the world of her friends and colleagues, the social world we occupied together, was the world in which I still performed the version of Daniel that felt safe. Not dishonestly, I want to be clear about that. I was not living a lie. I was simply not fully visible, and the line between not fully visible and hiding is blurry in ways that take time to understand. I thought I had made peace with it. I thought that having Renata know was enough. I was wrong about that. But I didn't know I was wrong until something changed. It happened gradually, and then suddenly, the way most things that matter happen. Renata had a group of close friends, 5 women she had known since her late 20s, a circle of people who had been through major life events together, who were, by the time I entered the picture, as close as family. I liked them. They liked me, or seemed to. I was always, in any social situation, a reliable presence, attentive and warm and easy to talk to, because those were skills I had developed early out of necessity. But I was always performing, in those gatherings. Always the version of Daniel who had no interior rooms with closed doors. About a year and a half into our marriage, Renata began hosting a monthly dinner with this group. It was her idea, a response to the fact that everyone had gotten busy and the organic frequency of their contact had dropped. On the third of these dinners, something shifted. I was in the kitchen making dessert when I heard laughter from the dining room, the particular laughter of people who have known each other long enough to be genuinely funny together, and one of the women, Priya, came into the kitchen to pour more wine and stopped and looked at me for a moment with the kind of expressiveness that very perceptive people sometimes can't quite contain, and she said, "You know, Daniel, you are the most carefully presented person I have ever met." I laughed, because that was my reflex. "Is that a compliment?" She tilted her head. "I think so. But I also think it must be exhausting." She went back into the dining room. I stood at the counter with a spoon in my hand and felt, very suddenly and very unexpectedly, like crying. I didn't cry. I finished the dessert and brought it out and sat down at the table and was present for the rest of the evening with the same practiced warmth I always managed. But what Priya had said followed me. I had not been seen by her, she hadn't seen anything specific, but she had seen the shape of the concealment, which was almost more destabilizing than being seen outright. Because she had named, without knowing what she was naming, the exhaustion. That night, after everyone had gone home and we were cleaning up together, Renata stopped in the middle of loading the dishwasher and looked at me. "Are you okay?" she asked. "Priya said something to me," I said. And I told her what it was. Renata was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've been thinking about something for a while. I want to talk to you about it, but I want you to hear me out fully before you respond." I said okay, and we sat down at the cleared table, and she told me what she had been thinking. She had been thinking, she said, about what it cost me to keep this part of myself invisible in our shared social life. She had been thinking about it not as a problem I had. Not as a condition or a quirk that needed managing, but as a form of ongoing self-erasure that she, as my partner, was in some sense complicit in by accepting its continuation. She had been thinking about whether it was fair to me. About whether the bargain I had implicitly made, acceptance in private, invisibility in public, was actually serving me or just serving my fear. She was not pushing, she said. She was not telling me what to do. She was simply saying that she saw me, all of me, and she thought that some of the people in her circle were the kind of people who would see me too, if given the chance. And that she wanted me to consider whether there was some version of being more fully present in that circle that might be worth the fear it would require. I didn't answer her that night. I said I needed to think about it, which was true. I did think about it, for weeks, with the kind of sustained focus that important things require. I thought about it with Dr. Khalid, who was still my therapist and who was, at this point, deeply familiar with the landscape of what I was weighing. I thought about it alone on early morning runs, turning it over and over while my feet hit the pavement and the city woke up around me. What I was really thinking about, I eventually recognized, was fear. Not the fear of what Renata's friends would think. I had, by this point, developed enough self-knowledge to understand that my own estimation of myself was not in their hands. The fear was something deeper and older, the fear of allowing the full version of myself to exist in the world rather than just in the protected interior of my marriage. The fear of crossing the line from being known to being seen. There is a difference, and it is not a small one. Being known is intimate. Being seen is public. And public visibility, for someone who has spent 4 decades learning that certain parts of themselves are not safe to show, feels like stepping off a cliff, even when you know, intellectually, that there is ground below. I said yes. Not recklessly, not all at once, not without a detailed conversation with Renata about what this would look like and what I needed it to feel like. But I said yes. And we planned together, carefully and thoughtfully and with a level of mutual consideration that I think was only possible because of the years of work we had done to understand each other, a way of introducing me more fully to her circle. The word is Sissy. I want to address this directly, because it is in the title of this story and I know it is a word that carries a complicated history. In the culture I grew up in, Sissy was an insult. It was a weapon, a word used to police boys away from softness, away from sensitivity, away from anything that was not demonstrably, aggressively masculine. I heard it aimed at other boys growing up and I felt, every time, the particular vicarious shame of someone who knows they are the true target of a wound being delivered to a proxy. The word was designed to make its subject feel small. Inadequate. Wrong. Renata began using the word differently, in the private language of our marriage, perhaps 2 years after we wed. She used it not as diminishment but as a term of particular, tender acknowledgement, a way of naming the specific confluence of masculine and feminine that existed in me without forcing it into any available category that didn't quite fit. In her mouth, in the context of our intimacy and our mutual understanding, the word became something else. It became a term of precision and affection rather than ridicule. This is the kind of reclamation that can only happen in safety and trust, with full consent and ongoing conversation, and I want to be very clear that it belongs only to our relationship, to the specific private grammar of our marriage. I do not offer it as a model or a template for anyone else. When Renata introduced me to her friends at the 4th monthly dinner, a dinner she had prepared thoughtfully, in a context she had carefully chosen, she introduced me as her pretty sissy partner. She said it warmly, matter-of-factly, with the same tone she might have used to introduce me as her incredibly stubborn partner who always wins at Scrabble. It was said with love. It was said with full knowledge of what the word meant in the specific context of our relationship. And it was said as an invitation, not a demand, not an outing, not an act of overexposure, but a gentle opening of a door that had been closed for a very long time. The room was quiet for a moment. I was standing in the kitchen doorway. I could feel my heart beating. I was, to be honest with you, terrified. Not the catastrophic, world-ending terror of my adolescence, but the clean, simple fear of someone who is choosing to be seen and does not yet know what will be reflected back. Priya looked at me for a moment. Then she smiled, not the polite smile of social accommodation, but something warmer and more immediate. Well, she said, that's not something you hear every day. Tell me more. And that, improbably and simply and without drama, was how it began. The conversation that followed was not easy, exactly, but it was good. Renata's friends, Priya, and Keisha, and Isabel, and 2 others named Maria and are not naive or politically uniform or of a single mind about anything. They asked real questions, the kind of questions that people ask when they are genuinely trying to understand rather than when they are performing understanding. There were moments of awkwardness, moments where I had to find language for things that don't have widely agreed upon language, moments where I could see confusion or surprise or uncertainty move across someone's face. But there was no cruelty. There was no dismissal. There was no reaching for exit routes or attempts to redirect to safer topics. Keisha, who is a social worker and who I think had some professional context for what was being discussed, said something toward the end of the evening that I have thought about many times since. She said, "The thing that strikes me most about what you're describing, Daniel, is how much of yourself you had to manage for so long. And how much of the management wasn't about protecting yourself from real harm, exactly, it was about protecting yourself from the possibility of people's reactions. And those are actually different things." She was right. And putting language to that difference, the difference between real danger and the anticipation of danger, was, in that moment, genuinely useful to me. Because anticipation of danger can keep you organized around avoidance long after the danger itself has diminished or disappeared. It can keep you locked in the behavior patterns of a frightened 10-year-old even when you are a grown adult with a whole life. And naming that, having it reflected back to me by someone who had been a stranger to my interior self for hours earlier, was unexpectedly moving. I want to say clearly that not every response was perfect. Maria, who is a warm person, but a more traditional one in her values, was quieter than the others and I could see her working through something. She was not hostile. She was not dismissive. But she was processing in real time, and the processing was visible, and I respected it more than I would have respected a performed acceptance that hadn't gone through anything. When she spoke, eventually, she said something careful and genuine. I don't know that I fully understand all of this, and I'm not going to pretend I do. But I do know you, Daniel, and I know you're good to Renata, and I think understanding follows relationship, so I'm not going anywhere. It was not a celebration. But it was real. And real, I have learned, is worth more than spectacular. In the days and weeks that followed that evening, I was in a kind of emotional weather I didn't have a word for. Not happy, exactly, though there was happiness in it. Not relieved, though there was relief. It was more like the feeling of having carried something for so long that the shape of the carrying had become part of your body, and then setting it down and standing up straight for the first time in years and feeling every muscle that had been holding the weight slowly, carefully release. There was some grief in it too. I won't pretend there wasn't, grief for the years of silence, for the energy spent on concealment, for the younger version of me who had needed this and not had it. Grief is often part of growth, I have found. They are not opposites. I called my mother about a month after that dinner. I had not told her, in all of this story, in all of these years. She was 71 by then, still sharp, still the precise and practical woman who had made dresses in her sewing room and always had fabric scissors that she forbade anyone else from using. I called her on a Sunday afternoon and we talked for a while about ordinary things, her neighbor's hip replacement, Marcus's kids, whether I had tried the new recipe she'd sent, and then I said, "Mom, I need to tell you something that I've been keeping from you for a long time." She was quiet for a moment. "All right," she said. I told her. Simply, plainly, without drama. I told her about the lavender dress I had touched at 7 years old. I told her about the blouse in her closet. I told her about the years of silence and the therapy and Renata and the dinner with the friends. I told her the whole arc of it, as simply as I could, in about 15 minutes. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. Long enough that I said her name, checking that she was still there. "I'm here," she said. "I'm just thinking." Then she said, "You know, I always knew there was something you were holding. I thought it might be something about a relationship, or that maybe you were unhappy in your work, or, I don't know what I thought. I just knew there was a room." She paused. "I wish you'd told me sooner. Not because it would have changed anything. But because I would have liked to have known you, that part of you, for longer." I sat in my kitchen and looked at the wall and felt something break open that I hadn't even known was still sealed. Because that is what shame does, it predicts rejection so consistently and so vividly that you begin to confuse the prediction with the reality, and you make decisions based on a reality that was never actually true. My mother's response was not the response of the culture I had internalized. It was the response of my mother, a particular human being who loved me, who had always loved me, who had been waiting for a door to open for decades without knowing what was behind it or that there was a door at all. We talked for another hour. She asked careful questions. She told me about a neighbor of hers from 40 years ago who she had always suspected of carrying something similar, and how she had always wished she had been more forthcoming with him so he had known he had a friend. She was not confused. She was not grieving. She was present, and curious, and entirely herself, and I understood, sitting with the phone to my ear, that I had lost nothing by telling her the truth. I had only, and finally, gained. Marcus was harder. I won't pretend otherwise. He is a good man, my brother, genuinely good, the kind of person who shows up when you need him, who keeps his word, who has been devoted to his family in a way that I admire. But he is also someone who was formed in the same culture I was, who absorbed the same lessons about masculinity and its requirements, and who did not have the same years of therapeutic processing that I had. When I told him, about 6 weeks after I told my mother, at his kitchen table with his wife and kids mercifully absent for an afternoon, he did not respond the way my mother had. He sat with it for a while in a different kind of silence, the silence of someone reorganizing their mental categories in real time, and then he said, "I don't think I get it, Daniel. I'm going to be honest with you." "That's okay," I said. "You don't have to get it right now. But you're all right? This isn't, you're not in trouble or anything?" "I'm not in trouble. I'm actually better than I've been in a long time. He nodded slowly. He picked up his coffee cup and looked at it and put it down. All right, he said. I don't get it, but you're my brother and I'm not going anywhere either. He paused. Does Mom know? She does. And she's okay with it? She is. He nodded again. All right then. Good. And he changed the subject, the way men of his particular formation change subjects when emotional territory has become too exposed for comfort. I let him change it. And over the following months, in small and unremarkable ways, he began to normalize it, a question here, a reference there, a gradual reintegration of his brother into his understanding without the false category that had occupied that space before. It was not a triumph. It was just ordinary human accommodation. Which, I have come to believe, is what most people are actually capable of if you give them enough time and enough honesty. I am 44 years old now. I have been in therapy, with Dr. Khalid and with others, for 13 years. I have been married to Renata for 7 years. I have been, in varying degrees and contexts and with varying levels of completeness, visible to the people in my life for about 5 years. Not fully visible everywhere, there are professional contexts and casual acquaintanceships in which I remain the version of Daniel that involves the least explanation, because not every setting calls for the full story and not every relationship has the depth to hold it. I have made peace with this. Selective disclosure is not the same as shame. Choosing which truths belong to which contexts is not deception. It is simply the normal, reasonable navigation of a complex social world by a complex person. But in the places that matter, in my marriage, in my family, among my close friends, with myself when I look in the mirror, I am fully present. No room with a closed door. No fraction of my attention diverted to the maintenance of a false surface. Just me. The actual, complete, reasonably well-adjusted, somewhat overthinking, deeply grateful version of me that took 40 years to allow itself to exist openly. What I have learned from all of this, what I want to try to distill and share in whatever time we have left together, is this: the cost of secrecy is not paid in a single dramatic moment. It is paid daily, in increments so small you barely notice each individual transaction. It is paid in the quality of your attention during conversations. It is paid in the quality of your presence in relationships. It is paid in the ongoing, exhausting work of maintaining a distance between your inner life and your outer expression, a distance that eventually makes you feel like a ghost in your own life, present but not quite real, visible but not quite seen. And what I have also learned is that the fear that maintains the secrecy, the fear of what others will think, of what they will say, of what they will do when they see the true shape of you, is, in the majority of cases, a significantly worse thing than the reality of disclosure. Not in every case. I am not naive about this. There are families and communities and contexts in which coming to visibility with something like this carries real and serious risk, and I would never suggest that the courage to be seen is the same thing for everyone, or that the stakes are the same. They are not. For some people, the calculus of safety genuinely requires concealment, and I respect that entirely. But for me, in my life, in my specific context, the fear was almost always worse than the reality. The monsters in the blank spaces on the map were almost always, when I finally walked into those spaces, simply people. Confused people, sometimes. Uncertain people. People who didn't have the language or the framework or the immediate capacity to understand. But people. Human, fallible, ultimately more interested in their relationship with me than in the specific contents of my interior life. People who, when given the opportunity to love me fully, mostly chose to try. I think about the boy in the sewing room, reaching out to touch the lavender dress. I think about the fear he carried away from that moment. The silence he built around it. The decades of careful architecture he constructed to ensure that no one ever had to know what he had felt when he touched that fabric and felt, for the first time, something that he recognized as his own. I want to tell that boy that the architecture was unnecessary. That the recognition was not something to be afraid of. That the softness he felt in that moment, the wish to inhabit a different kind of space, a different register of himself, was not evidence of a flaw but of a genuine complexity, and that genuine complexity, properly held and honestly expressed, is not something that destroys connection. It is, in fact, one of the things that makes connection real. I want to tell him that there is a woman out there named Renata who will use a word that was once a weapon as a declaration of love, and that in her mouth it will mean something entirely different than it did in the schoolyard, and that the moment she says it in a room full of her closest friends and he stands in the kitchen doorway with his heart hammering and his whole 37 years of careful performance trembling, the ground will hold. The world will not end. The people in that room will mostly look at him with curiosity and warmth and the basic decent interest of people encountering something genuine. And that Priya will smile, and Keisha will ask a real question, and Isabel will refill her wine glass and say, matter-of-factly, well, that explains the really excellent taste in scarves, and the laughter that follows will be the real kind, the kind that comes from genuine recognition, and that he will laugh too, with his whole face, without editing, without monitoring, for the first time in a very long time. I want to tell him that the laugh is worth the wait. That the visibility is worth the fear. That the full version of yourself, offered without apology to the people capable of receiving it, is always, always worth more than the careful performance that substituted for it for so long. I won't pretend that everything is resolved, because life doesn't work that way. There are still days when the old reflexes fire, when I catch myself managing my presentation in a new setting, when the ancient instinct to make myself smaller activates in response to some ambient social signal that my nervous system has interpreted as a warning. The habits of a lifetime don't evaporate. They fade. Gradually, and with work, and with the ongoing, daily practice of choosing presence over performance. But they fade. And on the days when the fading feels slow, when the old weight returns in some milder form and I feel the pull of the familiar concealment, I think about Renata at the table that night when she said, I want you to consider whether there is some version of being more fully present that might be worth the fear it would require. And I think about standing in that kitchen doorway. And I think about the basketball finally allowed to surface, shooting up through the water after years of being held down, rising up into the open air, free at last to be exactly what it was. We are all carrying things. Every single one of us. Different things, private things, things we have convinced ourselves we will carry alone indefinitely because the alternative is too frightening to contemplate. And I am not telling you that the right answer for everyone is the same as it was for me, or that visibility is always safe, or that the people in your life will respond the way Renata and Dr. Khalid and Priya and my mother responded. I cannot promise you that. The world is not uniformly kind, and honesty is not uniformly received. But I am telling you this, the version of you that exists in the secret space, the version that only you know, that you have been protecting and hiding and carrying alone, that version deserves to be somewhere in the world. It deserves air and light and the company of at least a few people who can receive it. It deserves to be, even if only in some small and carefully chosen context, no longer alone. And you are not the only one. Whatever the specific shape of what you are carrying, you are not the only one. That may be the single most important thing I know after 44 years of being human. The thing you think makes you unrecognizable is almost always the thing that, once named, makes you most recognizable to someone who needed to hear it. Name it carefully. Name it when you are ready. Name it to someone who has earned the trust it requires. But eventually, in whatever way and at whatever pace and in whatever context is genuinely safe for you, name it. Because the naming is not the end of something. It is the beginning of the life you have been living around without quite entering. And if this story, this one particular story from this one particular life, has helped you feel a little less alone with whatever you carry, then it was worth every minute of the telling. Thank you for watching and spending this time with me. If this story helped you understand yourself or others a little better, feel free to explore more on the channel.